to What Do You Want to Do, the show that will hopefully help you figure out what you want to do in life or reconnect you to what you love doing. Each show has a guest who is doing what they want to do, whether it's in their career or in addition to their regular job. Most importantly, we want to help you realize that no matter your age, you too can do what you want to do if you have the will to do it. Now here's your host, Leonard Kaplan.
Hey out there, welcome to What Do You Want to Do 2022. I'm back with another series of shows with people doing what they want to do, what they love to do, what they may have dreamed of doing when they were young. Maybe they didn't get a chance, and maybe then they made it a career or part-time or just kept it as a hobby. Let's go to our first guest right now. Phil Weinstein, otherwise known as Phil W. Welcome to What Do You Want to Do?
Welcome. Thank you so much for having me, and Happy New Year. It's great to be here and great to get to talk to you today. It's been a while since we talked, but I'm excited to be out here and talk a little bit about some of the things I love to do.
Now, the most important thing that I can see in your background is your dog. Tell me about your dog.
Oh, that's my dog, Lotus, who actually, I think she just heard you. Did you notice how her head came up and turned?
Yes.
She's on. She's getting up. She knows she is. She's also a little not camera shy, but she's a little bit of can have her camera focused tendencies when she knows you're trying to shoot her. She's hiding her face right now because she only does that if you present her with treats and other things. She is Lola. She is a show dog. But yeah, she's Lotus. She's about 10 years old. She's my rescue pup that I love. She's my baby.
That's the way to do it, the rescue bit.
Yep.
My first dog I found in the street, and that was in 1972. Then I found my second dog and my last dog so far in 1992 in Swampscott, in the streets of Swampscott, where I was working at the time.
I found a dog as well during probably around that same period of time in the early 90s. That was just walking the streets, and I fed it. It followed me home, and I kept that dog for a long time. It's amazing how much these days the love for animals is even more so. You know, like with people going to shelters, more supporting shelters, much more than it did say 20 years ago. It's a really beautiful thing. We both know a lot of people personally that do a lot of really great things for animals.
That's right.
It's very appreciated. As someone that, besides what I love to do for money, I work with animals a lot, like walking dogs, doing dog sitting, boarding, and things like that. So it's good to have that connection to animals, and there's so many of them. So it's good to see animals hopefully being treated better these days.
Well, the attitude towards domestic pets is a lot more sophisticated and developed these days than it was when I was a kid. That's for sure. In the 60s, you know, there were still dogs walking around. I mean, I found those dogs because they were in the street. Nowadays, you don't see dogs in the street because they're rescued by shelters, you know.
And when they get lost, people share them on social media. People want to talk about the problems that come with social media, and we could discuss that, but they do exist. But one of the great things about it is pets missing and the way that information can be shared to multiple places. I don't have any metrics to prove it, but I would believe that more dogs are saved since the invention of social media in the way that stuff gets spread out there than before that, where dogs can just get lost through the mix and such.
I'll buy that. And I think I know which person you're talking about. You're talking about Andrea Castanetti is one of them. She was on the show. Did you see my show with Andrea?
I did. I was watching some of your shows earlier today, and I was enjoying them.
Awesome. I'd like to hear that. Trying to get better and trying to get more spontaneous. I'm trying to smile more. I noticed that about myself. I don't naturally smile when I have a conversation, but I'm making an effort. Yeah.
In fairness, I know where you come from with the wrestling talk background, and you can't smile at those wrestlers. Will tell you they take that smile off your face. You know, you jabroni. You know, get that smile off your face, Leonard.
For people who don't know, Phil Weinstein, otherwise known as Phil W., has a podcast, and he used to be known, and still is, I guess, known as the Issues Guy.
Yeah, Phil the Issues Guy.
Phil the Issues Guy. But though you started off your podcast talking about issues, you don't do that anymore. You review movies, you review TV shows. You are not social media, but a media reviewer. Let's. Is that fair to say?
No, that's fair to say, and I'd say I'm also a media connoisseur in the way that I study and think about mass media throughout history. But that's very true, and because the foundation of what I started doing was I was going to Salem State and studying a theater degree and a communications degree, and a friend of mine who does a very well established podcast, Evan King Baby Duck, who does this show called No Borders, No Race, which focuses more on music, but he was doing a radio show and he encouraged me to go and do a radio show, which when I started and what I really wanted to do is I was watching a lot of Frasier at the time, and I loved it. As much as I love Cheers, and I do love Cheers, I think Frasier aged better in the sense of the timing of the comedy, and because it's more wordy comedy rather than slapstick or a love story dramedy. And I really wanted to be a calling guy. And I play in bands and I play in rock bands, and I had a song called Issues. So I decided to be called the Issues Guy. Call me in 1-800, call for your issues. And so I started out with that, and it slowly morphed when I started doing podcasting. I tried to do the same thing, and you were very supportive in those early days when I first started doing it online. I remember you helped me. We talked a little bit about the writer of Orange is the New Black. You joined me on one of my shows way back then. But I found hard getting any traction just talking about nothing to strangers.
Yeah.
So I was listening to a lot of sports talk too. Eddie Andelman was a big influence on me. I loved Eddie Andelman. I used to call on his show when I was younger. And I'd say Eddie Andelman and Frasier created a lot of ways. And then I decided, watching Breaking Bad, why don't I do a sports talk radio after show about Breaking Bad? And just for a lark, start a separate channel on YouTube for it. And for the first time ever, I had a video that got traction. And then I kind of just went down that road and kind of got trapped in a rabbit hole of some different shows that were bigger successes and brought in a lot of more people. And then that kind of adopted itself and kind of went down that line.
Now, what happens when you're doing your show or you're researching for the week? Do you do it weekly? You do. So what happens when you come to stuff that you don't like? I mean, you can't like everything. So how do you talk about it?
Honestly, that's one of the more difficult things when a show that you've built up a lot have reached a critical impasse of going from a quality show to a negative show. The problem happens, and I think a great example of that is the show The Walking Dead, which, without getting into specifics, when it started out, it was everything's arguably a great character piece on what an average person would do inside that kind of dynamic. And it grew into a little bit too soap opera-y, introducing other characters. It's tough because I feel like being creative about what you like about something is easy to be unique and do different things about it. You can only be negative in some way. But I will say this, my show has morphed at times into a place for almost everyone to be a echo chamber of complaining. So it turns into that as well, similar to the sports talk metaphor. When the Patriots or the Celtics lose, everyone calls in and says, you gotta fire I was gonna say Parcells. You gotta fire Patino or whatever, the random coaches. So in those situations, it's a very similar thing. I'm not going to spoil anything, but I was joining a friend this week in a show just to kind of, I guess, earmark the time when this is happening. The show Dexter came back and had a second series finale that was poorly received again by the audience. And it turned into a call-in complaining show with a lot of people complaining about how in having Monday morning quarterback perspectives. So there is an element of that as well.
So do you put yourself in the role of a moderator when that happens, or do you join along and you state your own opinion too?
Both. It depends if I have a guest. I do have a co-host who is one of my closest friends that does a lot of the shows with me, but he's a busy guy. He has a real job in helping people in the medical industry. So he can't always join me for this silliness, but he seems to be the more stereotypical Bostonian angry guy when something's going bad. In fact, his name is Joe, and he has something called a Joe rant, which the people watching will hashtag or shout out in capital letters, "We want a Joe rant." And in those situations, I tend to go devil's advocate or try to do things or say things that I might know that might trigger Joe to have one of his trademark breakdowns, with almost similar to a Simpsons episode when Bart tries to keep making Homer angry dad. And he keeps trying to, or when someone's trying to agitate Donald Duck to have a full-on Donald Duck explosion, and that's what I try to do. I'm the goofy, hey everybody, so he can go and just freak out.
That's great. That's great. So you have a very atypical, just your podcast alone is atypical. I want to go back now. I met you when you were a high school student, and I was the head of the cable club, and you used to come visit us sometimes. Mm-hmm. And you never quite joined, but we were always glad to have you around.
You also had me on even though I was not a member, you allowed me to be the sports anchor on a morning show that you did. I don't know if you remember that.
Oh, I do. That, you mean when I used to come in at 5 a.m. for Danielle's the news.
Yep, and
we did a morning live news show.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And our good friend Ariella was a part of that as well. And I became, for a brief period, the wacky sports guy. I would come down and do a wacky sports rant. And then I took your class as well, where my big final project with my friend Nick was, we did a video that was a copycat of the Larry Bird and Michael Jordan Nothing But Net commercial, where they used to be in different situations and shoot the basketball, and it would just go in. And we filmed it in the gymnasium. We filmed it down the street. It was sort of a big thing. And I love video editing, and yourself and the teacher that came in there after you, Mr. Reed, were definitely very influential on my love of editing. I was never a member, but I was always hanging out in there.
I'm glad. And by saying that, I'm not excluding you by any means, but I don't remember having a class with you.
Yeah, it was a class. I remember us going into where Mr. Martino's room was and using that VCR at times to watch it, and I believe it was you were helping out that class at times.
That was my first subbing gig, because I had already been laid off by Warner Cable, and I was transitioning from being the media guy to not having a job. So that was sort of a depressing. Maybe I blotted it out of my mind.
Yeah, no. Honestly, I think most people that had interactions with me at that time probably blotted out of their mind.
No.
I'm kidding. But what was interesting about that is I definitely remember spending a lot of time with the kids that were cable club kids, which is why. For me to say, which is why I think I saw you a lot and spent a lot of time with you, and that we made some sort of connection that sort of lasted through time, even though I wasn't necessarily one of your students. But it did. But through like Julia and Ariella and all these other sorts of people that were more active in the cable club.
Yeah.
I ended up getting more active the couple of years afterwards because I think I started to, if you had stayed, I probably still would have gone down that road, but then they came in and redid the studio, and I was a big part of helping build the second studio when they took everything apart.
Then you were there longer than me, so you know what that means? That means you are part of the cable club.
I guess, yeah. I was part of the secondary cable club that came afterwards with Mr. Reed's presentation there.
So back then, now, when you were in high school, did you ever have, or did your parents ever urge you to go to college, do this, do that, get a regular job? And what was your reaction to that? Obviously, it was the opposite. Yeah. How did that come about?
I mean, my initial where my mother wanted me to go was, they wanted me to be a football player. And and go to something like, Brandeis or BU and get into become, a lawyer or a doctor, something to those effects. My reaction to that was always, I don't know, but I did try many years to put myself into more of a traditional dynamic. But for me, work has always been about how can work source my creative energy? How can I get enough work to be able to do what I need to do to make the money I need to make to be able to support my creative endeavors? But I did try to become like a real estate agent at one point in time. I did try to do that and try to push some situations without getting too personal. I had sort of a problem that happened towards the end of my high school experience that sort of threw me off my path, and I had to be forced to take a break for a bit in between my high school years.
Yeah.
So when I kind of came back, it was difficult. It was a difficult dynamic, and it was more they were just happy I was making it through at that point.
Right.
But then I went back to college when I was 28, 29, and I loved it. Like the dynamic that you had, and that's what without getting too, making this about you, what I enjoyed about Cable Club when I would come into that class, what I enjoyed about the dynamic I would have with Mr. Reed after the fact, and the fact that I'm sure you have with your students, is the feeling of it's more like how a college class feels, where you have more of a round table discussion. And so when I got into a college environment, it fit me much better from an educational standpoint, just because there's a different sense of just the dynamic of the way it works. I can't even verbalize the specifics of it, but I just felt more at home in that dynamic, and I thrived in a college environment.
I can tell you right now why, because it was more informal. Cable Club was very informal. College is not this regimented thing where, you can just show up or not show up, and you're responsible for what you do. It's not like you're being held in a prison. Let's face it. A lot of kids feel that way. And I felt that way when I was young. I never like to be told, especially I love to read. Books are my thing. I read. The reason I'm telling you this, you'll see in a minute. Books are great. I love books, but I have to pick the book.
Yeah.
If another entity is picking a book for me and telling me to read it. Even in college, I took a literature class, and of course they assign all these books. I hated it. Whereas if I discovered the books myself, I would have loved it. So that's what you're verbalizing, I think.
And the other part of that too is, I think, and this is one of the most important things I think we could probably do in the education system, is at a very young age, identify how kids learn and then teach in that way. Because I'm somebody that I wish I could learn from reading. I do not. I learned from listening. I took one of the best classes I ever took, and I encourage anyone that wants to go back to school after a long time to take a class like this, is a learning inventory class. It's a class that's dedicated to finding out what the best ways you learn are. For me, I learn listening and physically touching. I do not learn watching somebody do something, and I do not learn from reading. It goes in one eye, out my ear. I can understand poetry. I can analyze poetry, song lyrics. I can do that, short stories even. But once you get into more of a textbookian kind of thing, or listening to someone tell notes, I would ask sometimes my professors, or not professors, teachers in middle school or high school, because I wouldn't get the information and I didn't know it yet. But I would say, "Can I tape this class?" No, you can't audio, because I just want to tape the notes. And they think you're being lazy by not wanting to write notes. But I don't learn that way. Even when I sometimes act. And the only way I learn I'm not well, I sometimes act. And when I put and the only way I learn my lines is by audio recording myself saying them and then listening back on repetition. Otherwise, it will never stick.
That's amazing, an amazing use of technology there. What you're talking about is actually something that they taught me in one of my education classes when I was becoming a teacher, Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. We learn there are different auditory learners, like you said, there are musical learners, there are reading learners, and I'm not going to try to recite them all, but
Yeah, this kinesthetic learn. It's funny about the musical thing too, and I'm not going to do it because it's just silly. And I'm sure there's a generation of kids because of mnemonic devices. I still know all 50 states and I can sing it. Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, California. Like I can go through it. One of my other jobs that I do is I go into elementary schools, in daycares, in summer camps, and I teach kids about music and theater through like an interactive stage show. It's almost vaudevillian. And my encore that I do at the end is the 50 Nifty song. And it's amazing to me how much those things stick. I even remember speaking of Frasier chairs, there's an episode where the character of Coach is trying to teach Sam about history or about geography. And it's Liberia, it borders on the Adriatic. It's like Albania. The only reason I met someone from Albania and I started quoting Albanian facts because I still remember it from the Cheers episode where Coach sings the Albania, it borders on the Adriatic. And that's the only reason.
It's amazing, what you can remember, sometimes without trying, if it hits you the right way.
Yep.
So that's it's great that you discovered that about yourself. Some people never discover that about themselves. And they, I have a friend I grew up with, and she has reading problems. She can't understand. I remember we were in the 8th grade together, and I remind her of this all the time. We're in the 8th grade, and she says, I understand the words, but they go in and they go out, and I don't comprehend it.
Same thing.
So undiagnosed stuff, and that can affect you for the rest of your life if you don't find a way around it like you did.
Yeah, and I will give full credit to hopefully she's still doing well and still teaching, but if not, lots of love to you, Donna Mealy from North Shore Community College, who urged me to take that test. And actually, after taking that class, I started being a writing tutor in the writing lab at North Shore Community College and helping people pass Comp 1, which was a fun job to have. And I wouldn't have been able to do any of that if it wasn't for that teacher. And that's why yourself, Mr. Reed, Donna, a couple of other people through the North Shore and Salem State system, I hold at high esteem for being able to connect with me on a level that I always had trouble. I always felt a very us and them dynamic with the teacher, similar to the reasons why you said, because of that sort of almost in the army / prison kind of dynamic that you feel in regular regimented school sometimes.
Yeah, it's amazing. So let's trace. Okay, so you found your way to get through to yourself, to
Eventually.
be able to learn, getting around the ways that you didn't learn. You're in college. What did you do next?
After college, I went to North Shore, then which I did a lot of theater, and then I transferred to Salem State. When I graduated Salem State, that's when I went into real estate initially, and I worked in real estate for a couple of years and did not connect with what I was doing. Because I had ended up graduating with a public relations degree, and at that same time started to do my radio show and perform. And I just didn't feel connected to what I was doing. And I felt like I needed some sort of change work-wise. And that's where I started to gravitate myself more towards trying to find a path to performing. And which led me to eventually finding the job working with kids and being a children's performer, which essentially, as I want to say, it's educational. It's way more performy than educational. It's like doing a Steve Martin stand-up comedy bit for kids, really. And you're say funny jokes. I'm a cow. I say moo. I taste great on the barbecue. Like goofy stuff like that. But you throw in education and you throw in the ability to play some sounds of music. But I would say I like probably a lot of people when initially graduating college struggled to find the use of my degree with what I really wanted to do. And I feel like that synergy isn't always there for people, and it's tough to find that. And I had thought, for me, real estate was a good place to go because there's high financial ends and you can do PR with it and you can be people person, but it had a whole bunch of other challenges that I wasn't involved with. One of them is having a baby face and looking young compared to some of the other people in the area doing it, and not having fulfilling a lot of confidence. People working with you and then working with somebody else. Sales isn't really my thing like that. So I also went through some health struggles for a few years after college that were difficult to go through. But ultimately, coming out of all of that, finding my path to do things that I love that can still, pay the bills as well.
And where does your band come in?
Bands are interesting because I've played rock music in some way, shape, or form since I was 15, 16 years old. And it's had some positive points, and it's had some bands that have had moderate levels of success in the sense of played some big shows. I've played the Freedom Rally 3 or 4 years in a row in the early 2010s. Played CBGB's a couple times before it closed. Opened up for a couple bands that ended up going on to big successes, and wrote a handful of songs that I feel are pretty good songs. But at this point, I have being in a band, like many other projects, is very difficult to maintain with lots of people. So I've been lucky that I have one guy right now that we are working on a 2-piece project that is creative. And I find that some of my major musical influences at this point is people like Weird Al. I want you to laugh as much as you find musical entertainment, as I am, Weird Al's son here anyways.
It's funny about Weird Al because I kind of dismissed him for a long time, and then I watched him fairly recently, and he is brilliant.
Yeah, he is.
There's nothing short of brilliant.
And it's amazing to see where he came from. As another show that had a great influence on me back in my childhood days of listening to was Dr. Demento, which was a show that came on WZLX or when I heard it would be WZLX on Sunday nights at 10 p.m. I believe it would come on, and it was the first thing that I heard comedy rock. So from a musical standpoint, I've been lucky with writing a couple of parody songs that connect with my podcast. My podcast, as I mentioned earlier, is a lot of it is live. A lot of it is in doing it in live contexts, but I also have pre-recorded and written some songs. And through that, I've been lucky enough also to go to some conventions and speak live to some of the people that I talked to about the television shows, and made some friendships with some of those other creators. I went to 2 years in a row, a Game of Thrones convention, and got to meet a couple of the actors, some of the other creators. So those were always good experiences, and it's been good to be able to try to synergize all of those things together. And it's tough. It's a tough struggle. There's ups and downs because so much of the success of what I'm talking about is based around the success of the show that is on, and the media landscape of how people engulf and enjoy television and movie media is so different than it ever was, and has changed so much in even the last 10 years, 8 to 10 years, that I'm looking for that next way in at this point, because it's tough. Not everyone watches everything at the same time. How do you cover something that drops on a streaming platform when it all comes out all in one? But those are some challenges, and that's how I integrate some of my rock band stuff into the other things that I do.
That's great. Now, do you ever feel like you've bitten off more than you can chew, like when you're split in many different directions? It sounds like you really enjoy it.
Yeah, I feel like at times that, yes, that I have trouble. It more happens with the musical instruments and playing multiple instruments. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I feel like I can focus too much on one thing. And I would say also that it makes it difficult to do other things that I might want to do, because I do have other interests beyond these two ventures. Music is tough because there's a lot of lead up. Like, for instance, last year or 2 years ago now, it's hard to lose track of time. In 2020, I was lucky enough, or 2019 leading into 2020, I was lucky enough to do the first acting I had done in 10 years.
That was my interview with Phil Weinstein, part 1. Join me again next week for part 2. There's plenty more. So until then, what do you want to do?